Good morning and welcome to Friday Morning with Esther and Phil here on GB News. We've got lots coming up for you on the show today.
Today marks 1 year since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Throughout the show, we'll be speaking to various people, including the former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, as well as Alexander Rodnyansky, who returned to Ukraine to advise President Zelensky when the war started last year.
And big question for you here, do we have the right MPs and are they doing the right things? We'll be joined by an author who this week asked those questions.
And it's another anniversary today. 40 years ago today, one of the most controversial by-elections in history took place. We saw the biggest ever swing in a by-election. We'll be joined by the Labour candidate for that election who lost to the Liberals.
And as ever this morning, we want to hear from you, so get involved in the show. Email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. But before we start the show, here's the latest headlines with Rhiannon.
Good morning, it's 2 minutes past 10. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The UK is marking the first anniversary of the invasion in Ukraine with sanctions, imposing an export ban on every piece of equipment that Russia uses on the battlefield. The move is part of a raft of measures which also hit President Putin's closest allies, including his former chief of security and the chief executive of Nord Stream 2. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak's due to lead a nationwide minute's silence. He's also expected to urge G7 nations to move faster in arming Ukraine's troops with longer-range weapons. Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says supplying Ukraine with fighter jets won't happen anytime soon.
I think it's just really about managing the realities of saying that we just simply can't hand over Western jets and expect them to be used in the short term. I think what you can say is that if there are other countries with Russian or Soviet jets, which they could just transfer over, Britain will explore what it can do to give those countries that reassurance that their own skies will be protected. We've already done that in places like Romania and Poland, where we've flown patrols to help with protecting their skies, and obviously we have some air defence assets in Poland. So I think that is, to me, the best and quickest way we can help Ukraine.
The Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey says Labour welcomes the new sanctions but wants to see a longer-term plan.
We've got to move beyond ad hoc announcements of military support for Ukraine, which have had our fullest support. But we've got to move to a 2023 plan and beyond, setting out the military, humanitarian, economic assistance we're willing to provide. That would give Ukraine greater confidence that our supplies will be sustained. It will help encourage other countries to do more. And above all, it will signal to Putin that things are going to get worse, not better, for Russia.
A minute's silence will be held across the country at 11 to remember the victims of the war. In Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky attended a ceremony in Kyiv with families of soldiers killed in the conflict. He described the past 12 months as a year of pain, sorrow, faith and unity. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians have died following Russia's invasion, which has resulted in the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. The United Nations has overwhelmingly approved a resolution demanding Russia end its offensive and withdraw its forces. The world, too, has been reacting, countries holding vigils and marches to support Ukraine. The Eiffel Tower lit up in the colours of the Ukrainian flag. In Brussels, blue and yellow adorned the European Union's headquarters. And in New York, hundreds gathered outside the Russian consulate to show their respects. In other news, a fourth man has been arrested in connection with the attempted murder of an off-duty police officer in Northern Ireland. Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell was shot multiple times by two masked gunmen on Wednesday night. He was with his son at a sports centre in Omagh. He remains in a critical but stable condition in hospital. Police say dissident Republican group, the New IRA, is the primary focus of the shooting. Value products in supermarkets have been hit hardest by inflation, with prices rising more than 20% in a year. Consumer Group Which found the cheapest supermarket ranges were much higher than overall grocery inflation. 25,000 food and drink products at 8 major supermarkets were analysed. Cheese, milk, pork sausages and muesli are among the everyday items that have seen the biggest price increases. Nominations for the SNP leadership race will close at midday today. It follows Nicola Sturgeon's surprise resignation last week. Health Secretary Hamza Youssef, Finance Secretary Kate Forbes and former Community Safety Minister Ash Regan are expected to be on the ballot. Candidates must have at least 100 nominations from a minimum of 20 local party branches to go through. Police say there's been a possible sighting of a missing hiker in the Scottish Highlands. Carl Sambrook from Yorkshire, along with his dog Bane, were last seen on Sunday walking in the Lost Valley area. Concerns are growing for his welfare. Police Scotland's asking anyone with any information to phone 101. And a new report has found public sector staff are becoming burnt out and quitting jobs, whilst employers claimed £26 billion of free labour last year. The TUC says workers put in about 7.5 hours of unpaid overtime a week in 2022. The union's urging everyone to work their scheduled hours only. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, it's back to Esther and Philip.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. We're joined throughout the show this morning by former UKIP Deputy Chairman Suzanne Evans, as well as the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Mark Littlewood. So both welcome.
Hi.
Obviously, we're a year on from the war in Ukraine. What are your thoughts today, Suzanne?
I think, first and foremost, it's got to be, what a shame it's a year. I think when this war started, we all thought and hoped that it would be over much, much quicker. And here we are looking, having not just been at war with Ukraine and Russia for 1 year, but it's looking like it's going to be another year, if not more years. I think the other thing that concerns me is just how much it's escalated. Already we've had 7,000 Ukrainian civilians killed, 8 million Ukrainian refugees, and yet there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. I was just looking back at some of the comments that the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson made when this all started, and he talked about international sanctions being able to strike at the heart of Putin's war machine. He expected those to work. In August last year, Boris Johnson was saying Putin gets weaker with every passing month. Now, of course, this week he's called for Britain to send jets to Ukraine. And this is what concerns me, this escalation of the conflict, that other countries are going to be dragged in. There was talk by the German newspaper Der Spiegel yesterday that Russia and China are negotiating the purchase of 100 strike drones. I'm really concerned about how this is going to end if it does.
Mark?
Well, rather like Suzanne, I don't know what the end game is, and at some point we're going to have to consider that. You know, I understand that you can say every last centimetre of territory must be reclaimed, and there's no doubt in this war who the good guys and who the bad guys are, but that doesn't necessarily get you to a solution. I suppose, it's not really a cheerful thing to say, but if I remember rightly from a year ago, and I'm no military specialist, but sort of everybody assumed Putin would have taken Kiev within 3 weeks, that it was just a matter of time, it would fold like a deck of cards. And I guess this kind of proves, in terms of war, it's not so much the size of the dog in the fight as the size of the fight in the dog. And it's quite unbelievable, as I say, I'm not a military expert, to see the Ukrainian resistance. But I am with Suzanne, at some point, this needs to come to an end, not, hopefully with Ukraine reclaiming its territory, but the international powers need to get around the table and work out what that could possibly look like.
Mark and Suzanne, you'll be staying with us throughout the show, but now joining us is Alexander Alexander Rodinansky, a former academic at Cambridge University who returned home to advise Zelensky on economic policy, and when Russia invaded last year, was immediately invited to join the Ukrainian president in an underground bunker beneath the bank over. So, Alexander, I'd like you to talk us through you being there as war started and then going into the bunker and what happened and what was happening down there.
Sure. I mean, obviously, it wasn't very pleasant on that day. We all woke up at pretty early in the morning, around 4 a.m., 5 a.m. I remember the first blast that struck, and that basically woke me up. I was awake slightly before, but then I heard them, as soon as they came. We were invited into the bunker. We have been on many occasions to the bunker ever since, on and off. Kiev was very empty in the early days of the invasion and became really empty for the first month or two. Then, after the Russian offensive had failed to capture Kiev for the Battle of Kiev, they had lost the Battle of Kiev. Kiev became more lively again, but it's still far from normal compared to what it used to be. So look, we've been living this reality ever since, as you know, and now the war has shifted to other regions. It's mainly concentrated in Donbass in the south of Ukraine. And we're trying to regain control over all of our territory. And we have no doubt that we'll be successful, but unfortunately we're paying this extraordinary price, a price that we should never have been, should have been paying for our freedom. But unfortunately we have to, so that's what it is.
Alexander, I just wondered, how surprised were you and was President Zelensky when Russia did actually invade? Did you actually really believe it was going to happen, or did you actually think, they're not going to do this, it's all bluff?
Yeah, good, interesting question. I mean, we were sort of privately divided on what we expected, even though we knew the threat was very real and we were receiving all sorts of intelligence and information, our own intelligence, foreign intelligence, that seemed to confirm that, this was, very likely. I can speak for myself. I was convinced that it was going to happen. I mean, I'm not trying to, say I knew everything, but I thought I had a pretty good understanding of what was going on in the mind of the Russian leader. And unfortunately, it seems like I did. I mean, he failed to subdue Ukraine over the years with any other means that he potentially had at his disposal at the time. Russia didn't become a magnet for the region, so Ukraine didn't voluntarily team up with it, if you want. Russia, didn't convince anybody in Ukraine in any other way. So the only tool at their disposal that was remaining was essentially military force, and that's exactly what they used in order to basically have Ukraine under their own sphere of influence, as they say. So you kind of saw it coming. You saw it coming also from the way that the Russian leader spoke and the way he acted over the years, and increasingly towards the end. And you obviously saw it coming from all the preparations and the intelligence that you saw if you looked at the military preparations and what they were actually building, just across our border. So look, I mean, we knew that was very serious. Some of us were, convinced that it was going to happen. Some of us wanted to believe until the very end that it's not going to happen.
Alexander, you've obviously seen President Zelensky at close quarters, and you were there right at the start. How have you seen him change over the last year?
Well, the situation is obviously tough for everybody. He's been, very strong throughout. He's endured a lot, and he's shown great leadership, and he's really lived up to the task. So I wouldn't say that he has changed as a person, but he's obviously adapted to the circumstances. So, we've been in this for a year, and I think everybody's been coping pretty well.
How do you see the war actually coming to an end? I mean, we're a year on, we appear to be in some kind of stalemate. From a Ukrainian perspective, how do you see this drawing to a close?
From our perspective, there's no doubt what we want to achieve. We want to, restore control over all of our territory, which is internationally recognized. There's no doubt where, all of our territory is, where Crimea belongs. It's all part of Ukraine. So we'd like to reestablish control. That's the objective. We want to push Russia's army out. And ultimately, there is no other way to end this war, because if we agree to any sort of compromise, that's just going to invite more aggression from Russia in the future, even if there is some sort of truce temporarily or some ceasefire. The way they think about this is that they have all the time in the world, and they think about this as the three partitions of Poland, if you want, in the 18th century, which took, decades, essentially, until it was complete and Poland was erased from the map of the earth. So that's probably how the Russian leader thinks. And given that I was, correct in predicting their behavior before and their thinking. I think I'm pretty correct this time, unfortunately, as well. So there is no pressure right now domestically within Russia. So they think, they have all the time. And we have to make sure that they're wrong, that this is just another miscalculation on their part, just as bad as what they expected when they started this war effort, that Ukraine would fold within 3 days or something.
Alexander Rodnansky, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning.
We're joined now by military historian and author Peter Caddick-Adams. Peter, thank you very much for joining us this morning. First of all, how much has the Ukrainian resistance to the Russian army and the ability to fight back, how much has that come as a surprise to you? Because it certainly come as a surprise to Putin.
Well, I think the context is, of course, that this is the 9th anniversary of the war in real terms. Russia or Russia's sort of militias invaded the Donbass in 2014. So Ukraine's had a long time to learn, particularly not just in battle, but in terms of cyber warfare and information warfare. But what we do know is, of course, the Ukrainians are very, very quick learners. And since 2014, they've been trained and equipped and helped and instructed by the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom in, modern warfare and modern doctrine. So, the context is actually just wider than a year of battle. But the really interesting thing is the Russians haven't learnt. They're much, much slower on the uptake. And I think that's the sort of traditional Russian viewpoint that quantity is their way of trying to swamp a battlefield, whereas the Ukrainians, they're far more tiny population, far smaller army. And they've had to learn, and they've embraced high-tech solutions far more than the Russians. That reflects so well on their armed forces. They are the most experienced armed forces in combat today.
Peter, people will say now we've moved into a war of attrition. And what are the ways this war can come to an end? Because ultimately, that's what we want to do. So how would you say we need to pursue that path to peace?
Well, we've had a year of war. Joe Biden sort of bookended that at the end by looking back on what Ukraine has achieved. We now have to look forward to the next year of war. The first thing we can say that history tells us that you can't impose a peace if there's no consensus on either side for that peace to happen. And that's certainly the case at the moment. Russia is not interested in pursuing any kind of peace. There's no off-ramp, as the phrase goes, for Vladimir Putin, not because there isn't one, but because he's not looking for one. He hasn't reached that exhaustion point yet, and he feels, just like Stalin, his predecessor, did, that he can spend more people than can Ukraine, and it's an awful thing to say, but there's no evidence that he cares about human life at all, his own or the Ukrainians. So until the Russian mentality is exhausted enough to want to come to the conference table, then trying to impose a peace from outside going to be very difficult. You'd have to have a huge demilitarized zone funded by the rest of the world at huge expense, possibly for decades, like the demilitarized zone in between North and South Korea.
But let's look at who Russia is reaching out to now and how he could be getting support, and that is with China. How will that fundamentally shift the balance?
Okay, well, China and Russia have been talking for a long time, and this is absolutely no surprise. They're not natural partners at all. And China's interest in siding or helping with Russia is not because they like the Russians. It's because, one, they're buying cheap oil from Russia at the moment, for as long as that lasts. And secondly, this dissipates American military power away from the Pacific. So the longer that China can side with Russia, America particularly has to divide its military focus in two different directions rather than just one, looking at sort of Taiwan. And that's the Chinese aim. And similarly, Iran palling up to Russia for exactly the same reasons. It forces America just to dissipate its military assets, its intelligence and everything else. And so these are short-term interest plays, and it was inevitable. that Iran would do something with Russia, just like China. I don't see it as a sort of long-term problem because the two are not natural allies.
But the UN vote yesterday, which was asking for sort of overwhelmingly in a sort of immediate ceasefire, as it were, or coming to an unconditional withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine, you look at the voting there. So while it was a unanimous win, you look at who abstained, 32 countries, you look at those who supported Russia. Are you not seeing sort of geopolitical shifts here, which we in the West need to be mindful of?
I mean, the abstainees and those against were all the usual suspects. I mean, no one was at all surprised by the way the world voted. The important thing is the majority of the world voted against Russia, proactively disapproving and insisting that Russia withdraw. And that's the direction of travel that we need to have. And if you look at those who sided with Russia, I mean, they can't bring, small countries like some of the African states and some of the South American states can't provide Russia with much more than a little diplomatic support at the United Nations. And really, that's what Russia's got. So, apart from the sort of morale impact of somewhere like China and Iran and one or two other countries saying, we'll support you and we'll do a deal with weapons or whatever else, this doesn't make a lot of difference to the overall play.
Dr. Peter Craddock-Adams. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now we're going to come back into the studio. We've got Suzanne, we've got Mark here. Mark, this Chinese joining forces with Russia, as Peter was sort of the usual suspects, and yes, they were. I was slightly more concerned about that myself.
Yeah, Peter's obviously the expert here, but me too. I thought a potentially optimistic thing a few months ago was that it looked like China wasn't going to pick a lane here. I mean, probably do no more than stay neutral. But we used to think that they would always be hand in glove with the Russians as the default option. There was a window a few months ago, or is it that looked likely this time? Now less so. They seem to be leaning in. So we're, again, moving back to the kind of old world of conflict. Russia and China on the one side, the West on the rest.
And China does need the oil and fuel as it's coming out and coming out of sort of lockdown, Suzanne.
Yeah, it does, absolutely. I mean, for us here in Britain, we've been devastated by the increase in wholesale gas prices. We're spending 60 to 70 billion pounds more because of this. It's cost every single one of us in this country an extra £1,000. But other countries, of course, such as China, are getting that cheap oil and gas and absolutely loving it. It was no surprise, as the historian we've just listened to said, who voted and how they voted in the UN General Assembly yesterday. China, India, Iran, Pakistan, Sri Lanka and South Africa, all abstaining. All those countries are either benefiting in some way from the war, or they've got, like in the case of South Africa, strong links, historical links with Russia. But I also think what was interesting was he was saying the pressure, in a sense, to end it has got to come from within Russia. That's not happening yet.
Thank you both indeed. So coming up on the show, do we have the right MPs? And are they doing the right things? Big question. What do you think? Do email us, let us know, and also what you think of Ukraine 1 year on. We'll also be joined by an author who was asking those questions about MPs. So see you straight after this short break.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. It's 10:26 now. It's very timely that Mark Littlewood's in the studio with us because today he's brought out a brand new report from the Institute of Economic Affairs. And you can tell us more about this because we're usually aligned. I don't know if I am aligned with this report and your conclusions.
We're going to have a bit of a Barney here, aren't we? So we've released a report called Not Breaking the News, which is about the issue of whether online platforms like the Googles and the Facebooks should have to pay some sort of tariff or fee or levy to news sites because, you know, they link through to lots of news sites. And I can understand at first blush why that might sound like a good idea, but the report we've released today suggests no. And actually, the online platforms are, to a large degree, helping some of the legacy media, not the other way round. Even on TV, you've got every single newspaper here in front of you on GB News.
Out of fairness.
This is, I think, great advertising for this newspaper industry. And, of course, newspapers can then put their content behind a paywall if they want. I am a subscriber to both The Times and The Telegraph. But when we saw these sort of ideas come in Australia, it didn't so much get money out of the internet giants and into the pockets of struggling newspapers. What it did was the internet giants stopped linking so heavily to news pieces. And you actually saw a fall-off in news traffic, and that's what we fear would happen here if we went the same way.
And I can see that you're saying you're putting new people, driving new traffic to these sites, therefore. But I also think, shouldn't you be paid for the creative content that you're putting forward? For many years, people said all Google and other search engines did basically was make money out of other people's work. And this is what we're talking about here. Anybody else on my side for this? Should the person who's created the content get something for that content?
I'm kind of a little bit on the fence here. I mean, we've got the newspaper licensing industry, haven't we? So if you actually reproduce newspaper content, you have to pay a fee. But I do also, and I think that's absolutely right and fair, but I do also take Mark's point. And the problem is when you bring in any kind of regulation or any kind of ban, there are unintended consequences. And as Mark said, we've already had the experience of Australia when they tried to make the big tech giants pay up and it didn't work.
But Mark, I mean, we've had this before with the BBC. The BBC were accused years ago of basically taking the content from local newspapers, putting it up on their website, and basically said that was unfair. And we ended up in a situation where the BBC, I think, paid for 150 or so regional journalists to work at local papers, which I thought was a sensible compromise.
Because they were destroying local papers because they were putting it on their website.
I mean, this seems to me to be a very similar situation.
But I think there's much more synergy here. I mean, that you could say that the BBC was being almost predatory with regard to local news. As far as Google or Facebook are concerned, please link to IEA stuff from the Institute of Economic Affairs for free. We want you to. We want you to link to our material, otherwise not so many people would find it. And the same, frankly, goes for newspapers. Still millions of people buy the hard copies, but it's very swiftly moving to online. Do these newspapers want it to be easy to find their platform on Google? I would have thought yes, so.
Is this then about crediting people with the content? So, in effect, if you're passing it off as your own content that you've just stolen from somebody else, that's one thing.
Yeah, that's theft.
That's
It's about links.
But in effect, that's what the BBC used to do. They used to put the story up on there as if it was
this is about links.
So this is about
here's a link to the Guardian story. Here's a link to the Telegraph. Here's a link to the Times. And I think that you should be able to put up those links for free. Indeed, most people are actively seeking them. My staff work morning, day, and night to try and get more people to link to the Institute Institute of Economic Affairs.
That where I'm saying, well, how do we make sure that the creator of the content is paid fairly and it's not just stolen, put on every platform, they don't get anything? Are you saying, actually, that's for people to get wiser on how they monetise then the advertising?
Exactly.
And do you think Google, etc., has moved on in the last 10, 15 years? At the moment, it might have been as of a Trojan horse stealing everybody's goods. Now it's how do you... And who are the brightest people, the greatest people at monetising?
Well, I mean, Facebook's been very interesting because that's actually fallen as a source of news, right? People that used to be a bigger news source that people would go to. So yes, the legacy media, and obviously they're doing this a lot already, needs to wise up, and I think needs to embrace that it's good news for them that their newspapers are on the table in a GB News studio, that Google links to them, that they're easy to find. They then have different propositions. Some of these newspapers rely wholly on online advertising, I think, like the Mail. Others try and charge you a subscription, like the Times or the Telegraph. The Telegraph has a cute little situation which I think you get 2 articles for free a week, but if you want any more... So the more links they get, the more people are going to say it's time to buy a subscription.
I
think he's won me round. I was cynical to start with, but I think he's won me round.
You've left me and you've gone to... How about then, let's throw this in. What about music streaming then? Why are we paying for music streaming?
Well, again, you can pay for the link. So if you're given a link to a Times article and you go through to it, it will say you need to subscribe. And if you link to a piece of music, if the person's put it behind a paywall, you'll have to pay for it. If they put it free on YouTube, you can watch it free on YouTube. So that's up to the content provider.
So has he won you round? You're rocking now.
No, my concern was always that the creators got the money they deserved for creating that content. What we've sort of got round to, and I think it's all been on a journey as well, that you've now got a sufficient platform you can advertise, and that's what you're saying. Just
charge a subscription.
But you now have to be smarter at monetising what you've written.
They do get revenue because, of course, the more people click through, the more subscriptions they get, the more they can advertise.
If they do.
And you know, every journalist puts their articles out there on social media. They don't just keep them to themselves and want them in the printed press. You know, journalists use all this
I'm
stuff.
a sucker for a free market argument. He's won me round again. Anyway, coming up 40 years ago today, one of the most controversial by-elections in history took place, which saw the biggest ever swing in a by-election. We'll be joined by the Labour candidate for that election, who lost. But first, here's the headlines with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Philip. It's 10:33, your top stories from the GB newsroom. The UK is marking the first anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine with sanctions, imposing an export ban on every piece of equipment that Russia uses on the battlefield. The move is part of a raft of measures which also hit President Putin's closest allies, including his former chief of security and the chief executive of Nord Stream 2. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak's due to lead a nationwide minute's silence at 11. He's also expected to urge G7 nations to move faster in arming Ukraine's troops with longer-range weapons. Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says supplying Ukraine with fighter jets won't happen anytime soon.
I think it's just really about managing the realities of saying that we just simply can't hand over Western jets and expect them to be used in the short term. I think what you can say is that if there are other countries with Russian or Soviet jets, which they could just transfer over, Britain will explore what it can do to give those countries that reassurance that their own skies will be protected. We've already done that in places like Romania and Poland, where we've flown patrols to help with protecting their skies, and obviously we have some air defence assets in Poland. So I think that is, to me, the best and quickest way we can help Ukraine.
A fourth man has been arrested in connection with the attempted murder of Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell in Omagh. He's in a critical but stable condition after being shot multiple times by 2 masked gunmen on Wednesday night. Police say dissident Republican group the New IRA is the primary focus of their investigation. And nominations for the SNP leadership race will close at midday. It follows Nicola Sturgeon's surprise resignation last week. Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf, Finance Secretary Kate Forbes and former Community Safety Minister Ash Reagan are expected to be on the ballot. Candidates must have at least 100 nominations from a minimum of 20 local party branches to go through. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Don't go anywhere. Esther and Philip will be back in just a moment.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512,
Virgin Media Channel 604,
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236,
and YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio,
with the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Welcome back, 10:37. Got lots of you have been getting in touch with us this morning, Phil.
Yeah, Margaret says, we must give Ukraine all the help it needs to beat the aggressor Putin, otherwise he will think he can walk into any country and take over. How dare he? Put him in his place. All countries of the world want to live in peace.
I've seen that in the papers today, haven't you seen? Boris Johnson saying, give the Ukraine the fighter jets. You've got Rishi Sunak later saying we've got to give them a decisive lead. Nick here, we cannot get soft with China. They will use it to their advantage and pick away at us for personal gain and dominance. China is a communist state, not a democracy. Self-reliance is key to survival. We were talking about that before, the China dimension.
Yeah, I thought this was interesting. Martin says, I believe that if Mr Trump had been the president at the time of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it would never have happened due to the fact that Putin could not handle him, and I think Trump would have moved forces and equipment to the Ukrainian borders and Putin wouldn't have carried on. And I hear lots of people say that they think that if Donald Trump had been president, Putin wouldn't have done it partly because of Donald Trump's sort of unpredictability, and so Putin wouldn't have been able to sort of predict.
Suzanne, quick answer on that?
Yeah, I think there's something in that. Yeah. I really do. I mean, we've got North Korea's now being much more agitating on a world stage. They weren't when Trump was in power.
He had an unpredictability about it, didn't he, Trump, that kept people in place?
He was certainly unpredictable. I wonder whether the haphazard evacuation from Afghanistan was the other thing, that suddenly America looked weak, poor and the rest of it, and that, unfortunately, not just being a disaster in its own terms, but also gave succour to Vladimir Putin and the weakness of the West.
And when they say Putin's in for the long game, he's do anything to win, well, he saw the West is only going to be there for a finite amount of time, and you're right, that withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Now, here's a question that I'm sure you're all asking at home. What's the point of MPs?
Come on, what is the point, Bill?
We're going to find out hopefully soon. That's what the writer John Oxley asked on his blog, pointing out that very few people are impressed by the 650 who do eventually end up in Westminster. And I'm delighted to say that John joins us now in the studio.
We put him the other side of the table. Exactly. We put Mark in between us.
John, I read your article, which I found really interesting.
That's good.
It was, and it seemed to me that what you seemed to be saying was, or the question you were posing is, do we have the right people as MPs, and are those people concentrating on the right things? Is that basically what you're concerned about?
That's exactly what I was saying. I mean, I think in any role in the corporate world, if you're going to hire someone, the two fundamental questions you ask are, what do we want them to do, and
what skills is the person who's going to do that job going to have? And what we've seen with MPs is the role has evolved, fairly organically over hundreds of years, to be honest. Yet we've not really had a deliberate conversation about it. MPs now have very different lives and backgrounds to what they did 150 years ago. They do very different things. But also at the same time, the selection goes on very much in the background. It's going on in the moment, but unless you're very involved in one of the parties, you don't see any of that. And so there's no national conversation about, are we getting the right people? Are we supporting them to do the jobs in the right way? And are we getting the right outcomes out of them?
And what's your solution to that?
Well, that is, it's a big question, and I think it's one that has to have input from all sorts of different people. But I think the starting point comes with looking at the various things that currently make up an MP's role. They are legislators. They vote on laws. Are they doing enough of that? Do they have enough time for that? Select committees, do they get enough resources dedicated to them? And then also, I think the big elephant in the room is, as you will know, this whole thing of MPs' casework, which has ballooned massively. You talk to people who were in Parliament in the 1970s and the 1980s, they'd say, you get one letter a week. My father was an agent and constituency chairman for a time in a marginal constituency, and the MP in the 80s kept saying, we need more people writing in so I can go and help them and get voters. And I don't think either of you would have ever have said that. And it's, MPs have sort of become this bucket for all the things that go wrong with the state.
Yeah, I think there is that. There's definitely a shifting face. Some people treat MPs as sort of a quasi sort of lawyer, some people as a social worker, other people a campaigner, other people come to our function and attend it. So I think that pull locally versus the national Westminster picture, I think that is also the dilemma. Mark, you're nodding there.
That is the dilemma. I mean, much as I love the two of you, the truth is I want fewer politicians and I want them to do less. So I wonder whether one of the solutions is to adopt, is it the rule they have in Texas, where the Texan Senate can only meet for 100 days a year or some such like? I don't have a solution to the case.
You just want less laws.
I want many fewer laws than we have at the moment, and it just does seem to what you've been saying, expand and expand and expand. And I'd like to find some ways of just slightly narrowing the influence of politics on our lives.
You see, John, I definitely think you're onto something here. I mean, I got elected for the first time in 2005, and it's changed massively since then, largely because of social media, email. I mean, back when I first got elected, people did still communicate with you by letter, largely. You used to go and pick up your sack of letters and whatever and bring them to the office every day. Whereas now, you hardly get any letters. It's all emails. The thing that really worries me, and this is about, it's campaign emails are the worst things, and an MP's reaction to them. So, for example, now, MPs should be, in my opinion, scrutinising legislation. This is the stuff that people have to abide by. The laws that somebody's going to have to implement, whether it's a business or an individual or whatever. And yet MPs are not interested in scrutinising legislation, whether or not legislation's fit for purpose or not. Nobody does that anymore. But what you do is you get thousands of emails with an instruction from your constituents, that the all-party group for Tiddlywinks is meeting next Thursday. I demand that you attend that meeting. And so when an MP thinks, well, shall I go to the all-party group for Tiddlywinks, or shall I go and scrutinise this really important legislation that could be restricting our freedoms, MPs will think, I'll keep my constituents happy. I'll go to the all-party group for Tiddlywinks. And I think this is really... I don't think the public who contact MPs realise the damage I think they're doing to the country. It's all very well-meaning, but it means that MPs are passing inadequate legislation that's not being properly scrutinised.
But then it's a clear definition, so this is what your MP does. And back to your first point, there isn't a clear definition. And MPs probably sell themselves down the Swanee, as it were, as well as when they're standing for election, because somebody's standing next to you, well, I'll always be there, I'll be doing this, I will be mowing your lawn if need be, I'll be going round seeing your mum, I will make sure I'm at every coffee morning. Now, if somebody's doing that and everybody wants to see you and you've got 70,000 people who have voted you in, no wonder the role's changing.
Well, this is a problem, isn't it? What's the number one aim of a politician? To get elected. That's the job description, effectively. There is no job description beyond that. And I think the whole party political system, and John does raise this in his article, the way the party political system works is the party chooses people who will not necessarily make good MPs, but people who will be loyal to the party, who will do what the party leaders tell them. And very often that means they're young younger people who are perhaps, I think, cynically, because I'm a bit of a cynic, that the party leaders think are a little bit more malleable, rather than people, dare I say it, like myself when I became a councillor at 45, which I think was just about the right age, because I think I'd got the emotional maturity to do the job, I had plenty of life experience, and I think I did a good job. But I think the problem now is we've got very, very young people getting into politics, seeing it at a very superficial level, and then they work their way up the train. Some of them never even have a day job before they become an MP.
Saying, in a way, isn't it? It's the Westminster bubble, it's the technocrats who've taken over, it's the civil servants who've taken over, and you don't have proper politicians who are actually steering the ship. So you have actually come full circle, haven't you?
Yes, exactly. And one of the things that, as it's become a bigger job, it's taken away the time that MPs can do other things, whether that's paid work, amongst their peers, or whether it's, other work in the community. You look at someone like David Maxwell Fyfe, who was an MP in the 40s and the 50s and was Attorney General. He practised law up in Liverpool, and he'd get the night train up, would practice law during the day in the courts, would come down, because Westminster then only sat in the evening, and then he'd do parliamentary stuff. And what that meant was he was getting a full working day out of the out of London, was speaking to other people in other cities, and was able to factor that sort of thinking in.
Phil, you've always said this, the changing hours of Parliament now. So some people demanded that, so it made it family-friendly. So I get those demands. But what it did is it meant you weren't in touch with maybe your constituents and then working all night in Parliament.
It's the irony of what you just said there, John, because actually the hours that Parliament actually sits in terms of for debates and things has never been shorter. I mean, people get 2 minutes to speech limits because there's no time for the debate or anything. And actually, it was based on being family-friendly. I mean, it wasn't family-friendly. If your family's up in Yorkshire and you're in Parliament, what does it matter what time you finish? But the government embraced it because it gave less time for people to scrutinise what the government were doing. Yeah. That was, and basically people fell into the government's trap,
equally, that also has come around to bite the bottom as well, because the camaraderie that you have with your MPs, if they're sat together later on, actually means you can unite them. And at the moment, they're saying everybody's tribal, people are falling into different factions. That's because they're not all together for night time. So that, again, that has
Who's to blame here, though, John? Is it the public to blame for basically asking politicians to focus on the wrong things? Or is it the politicians to blame for not being a bit more robust and saying, well, actually, I'm going to focus on the right things? Or the parties to blame for not picking the right MPs?
I think it's all of those. Everyone's incentivised in different ways. You can see absolutely why the party want people who are happy to do local stuff and not really challenge big policies. You can see why it appeals to the public to have someone who is at your beck and call and responding to the things you really care about. But I think the bigger problem, it's a governmental problem. It's not something that sits alone in what do our MPs do. It's about looking at how does this play into things like regional devolution. You look at somewhere like the United States, where you have the state legislatures, so less stuff goes to Washington, you can have those small
John,
areas.
I know one thing, I bet you our viewers have got a lot to say. What do you think your MPs are doing? Are they doing enough? Would you like them to scrutinise legislation or be there at your beck and call in the constituency? Email us now.
Now, today marks the 40th anniversary of the infamous 1983 Bermondsey by-election campaign, described by GBNews as the dirtiest and most notorious by-election in British political history.
Peter Tatchell, the then Labour candidate, faced a vicious homophobic campaign that saw him bombarded with violent threats. While Tatchell failed to win the seat, he went on to describe the campaign as a loss for me, but a win for others. And he joins us now to tell us more. So, Peter, are we bringing back unhappy memories from 40 years ago today? Do you want to tell us some of, I don't know, the abuse you got, what happened in that campaign?
Well, it certainly was an extraordinary, exceptional election. As you said, commentators described it as the dirtiest, most violent, and certainly most homophobic election in Britain probably ever. It's astonishing to think that when I was out canvassing, knocking on doors to win support, I was violently assaulted over 100 times. There were more than 30 attacks upon my flat, mostly bricks and bottles through the windows, but also an arson attempt, and even a bullet posted to my letterbox in the middle of the night. It was a very, very scary time. And of course, I was trying to champion the interests of local people. I was particularly fighting against property developers who wanted to take over the Bermondsey Riverside on the south bank of the Thames to build lots of big corporate office blocks and luxury flats for the rich and thereby force out local people. And it was really hard to do that campaign under that level of extreme violence, mostly from far-right extremists, but also some homophobes as well.
This was the biggest swing in by-election history, Peter. I'm sorry to remind you of that, but I just wondered: is that what it was solely down to, or were there other factors at play? Because the only reason I was thinking, I was reading up again about it last night, and the Labour MP who was retiring, Bob Mellish, I think, thought you were far too left-wing for his taste as the candidate. Was there other factors at play in that election other than the sort of homophobia that it's famous for?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of people said that my opposition to property developers moving in and squeezing out local people, they said that was holding up progress. Some even said that my proposals to redevelop Bermondsey as an urban garden city was communist agenda. Absurd nonsense. I've got to say that many people did not really get a chance to hear what I stood for because the media was just focused on my sexuality and my support for LGBT plus rights. They didn't really seem to care much about what I actually stood for and what I was trying to do.
But
it meant that a lot of people just had a very jaundiced view.
Peter, who was pushing that, though? Because me, looking back, Simon Hughes was the Lib Dem candidate there. And in the end, it turned out huge hypocrisy on his behalf, pushing this anti-homophobic agenda when he transpired later to have same-sex relationships, as I think he described it. So what do you think of him and how he ran his campaign against you?
Well, certainly the Liberal Party, Simon Hughes was the Liberal Party alliance candidate. They ran a very dirty homophobic campaign, that's true. And Simon did, to his credit, many years later apologise, and I've accepted his apology. But of course, they benefited from that homophobia. And Bob Mellish and John O'Grady, they ran a very homophobic campaign. They had their supporters sing a song which went like, Tatchell is an Aussie, Tatchell is a puff. Let's go down to Rockingham, which is where I lived, and throw him off the roof. That was the kind of stuff that was going on. People who had my posters in their windows, had their windows smashed. It was a very, very extreme time. Look at the policies I stood for. I argued for a national minimum wage to combat low pay. I said there should be a negotiated political settlement in the north of Ireland to end the war. I argued that there should be comprehensive laws to protect everyone against discrimination.
And
of
Peter,
course,
a lot of that, well, as you said, people didn't see and didn't get to know about. So
just very quickly, Peter, in 10 seconds, if this had been a general election, I'm presuming you would have won. You only lost because it was a by-election. Is that what you feel?
Probably, yeah, because it put the focus on me, and it made this the whole campaign like a national issue. But those 3 or 4 policies I just outlined, they were deemed extremist back then, but now, of course, they're the mainstream consensus, and even the Conservatives support them.
Peter Tatchell.
In stereo. Thank you very much indeed for joining us and reminiscing back on that, what was a torrid time for you, but a very important part of our history. Thank you very much indeed.
And I think, that was wrong. It was unnecessary. It was only years later really. You saw the hypocrisy of the Lib Dem candidate. They didn't care because it was winning at all costs. Sort of goes back to what Suzanne said before, is that the definition of an MP just winning an election.
Anyway, coming up, we'll be observing a 1-minute silence to honour those who have lost their lives so far in the Ukraine conflict. So see you after this short break for that national minute silence.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison? I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, welcome back. Now, very shortly, we'll be joining the rest of the country to observe a national minute of silence to mark 1 year since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And as we sort of prepare for that, Mark, it is a big moment, isn't it? It is a big moment to remember.
Yeah, it is. I mean, sometimes I wonder whether we have minutes of silence a bit too sentimentally. I think virtually every other football match I go to, there's a minute of silence. But I've come to quite like it. I think it is a good opportunity to reflect and in a calm way on what's unfolding. And I guess the hope is that we don't need to have too many more of these in years to come, specifically about Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I can't add to that. It's been a dreadful year, such huge loss of life, so many people dispossessed. Absolutely awful. Let's hope we don't have to have another minute next year. Unfortunately, I'm not that hopeful.
No, and of course it'll be particularly poignant because there's so many Ukrainians in the UK, refugees.
Yes,
families,
one of my neighbours. Yes,
families that are taking them in. So this minute silent was going to be particularly poignant for them, isn't it?
It is indeed. And
live pictures here now.
I mean, the city just devastated, really. Where will it end? I think we've basically reached a conclusion, have we not, this morning, that any of us can't see an end to it.
I mean, Mark, how are we going to end this stalemate? Because that seems to be where we are. In effect, Russia hasn't got the wherewithal to defeat Ukraine.
Yeah,
Ukraine doesn't seem to have the wherewithal to force Russia fully out of the country.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, therefore, tragically, I mean, unless Putin discovers this off-ramp that your historian guest was talking about earlier, there is probably just a war of attrition until one side starts to want to, end it rather than fight to the last inch. That's probably what we're going to see, I fear.
Or as he said, the people of Russia actually demand an end to it. But
yes.
Russia's not really suffering so much. We've had the news out today, its economy shrunk, but only by 2.1%. It was predicted to shrink by 15%.
People talk of a peace deal, but is that really going to happen? At least not yet. People say if there was a ceasefire, does that mean it's for a little while, but then they all start again and remain in a war situation? Or you've got a Russian retreat. Is that sort of feasible, possible? A Ukraine collapse? Or, worst of all, people talk about other, nuclear war. Extremists will not at all. But as I said, it is that minute to think and now reflect.
We've just observed a national minute of silence to mark 1 year since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We just saw there Rishi Sunak leading that minute silence outside Downing Street. We saw pictures of Keir Starmer in Cardiff leading the minute silence over there. And of course we saw the live pictures of Kyiv, who are obviously still facing the full brunt of that war with Russia. Thank you, everyone at home as well, for joining in that National Minute of Silence. Well, let's now get the latest headlines with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Philip. Good morning. It's coming up to 4 minutes past 11. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The UK is marking the first anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine with sanctions, imposing an export ban on every piece of equipment that Russia uses on the battlefield. The move is part of a raft of measures which also hit President Putin's closest allies, including his former chief of security and the chief executive of Nord Stream 2. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's expected to urge G7 nations to move faster in arming Ukraine's troops with longer-range weapons. But the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says supplying Ukraine with fighter jets won't happen anytime soon.
I think it's just really about managing the realities of saying that we just simply can't hand over Western jets and expect them to be used in the short term. I think what you can say is that if there are other countries with Russian or Soviet jets, which they could just transfer over, Britain will explore what it can do to give those countries that reassurance that their own skies will be protected. We've already done that in places like Romania and Poland, where we've flown patrols to help with protecting their skies, and obviously we have some air defence assets in Poland. So I think that is, to me, the best and quickest way we can help Ukraine.
Ukraine's president has described the past 12 months as a year of pain, sorrow, faith and unity. This morning, Volodymyr Zelensky attended a ceremony in Kyiv with families of soldiers killed in the conflict. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians have died following Russia's invasion, which has resulted in the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. In other news, a fourth man has been arrested in connection with the attempted murder of an off-duty police officer in Northern Ireland. Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell was shot multiple times by two masked gunmen on Wednesday night. He was with his son at a sports centre in Omagh. He remains in a critical but stable condition in hospital. Police say dissident Republican group the New IRA is the primary focus of the shooting. Value products in supermarkets have been hit hardest by inflation, with prices rising more than 20% in a year. Consumer group Which found the cheapest supermarket ranges were much higher than overall grocery inflation. Cheese, milk, pork sausages and muesli are among the everyday items that have seen the biggest price increases. And nominations for the SNP leadership race will close at midday. It follows Nicola Sturgeon's surprise resignation last week. Health Secretary Humza Yousaf, Finance Secretary Kate Forbes and former Community Safety Minister Ash Regan are expected to be on the ballot. Candidates must have at least 100 nominations from a minimum of 20 local party branches to go through. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens now, though. It's back to Esther and Philip.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Lots of you have been getting in touch with you as this morning, with your views particularly on MPs. What are they there for? What is their role? Phil?
Julie says, as an English person, I wonder what the point is of 117 Scots, Welsh and Northern Ireland MPs when most of their caseloads are done for them by their devolved parliaments. Oh, yes, that's right. They need to show up at Westminster at great expense so they can meddle and vote on matters which only apply to England. Shame on you MPs with English constituencies for allowing it and for letting Gove take away the small crumb that was English votes for English laws.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a lot of sympathy for Julie's point there. And Mick says, yes, we do need MPs. Earlier in the week at PMQ's, Esther asked the Prime Minister a very relevant question. Sadly, the Prime Minister did not answer the question directly. That was your question about the small boats.
Yeah.
When we were going to see legislation.
Because we need it and when to come forward, times of the essence. But also pointing out that was one of Rishi's key aims, but the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office did not have that on his key stated aims. And we have a problem there. Why was that and why isn't there? Now, we've got here, this one here, Margaret, Phil... I think, Phil, I think that was out of line when you say people don't realise the damage they do when they ask MPs to go to their interests instead of things in Parliament. Have you not seen the damage the MPs are causing by not standing together in Parliament?
Sorry, Margaret.
Yeah, and and then this one, Philip's absolutely right. MPs should be scrutinising legislation rather than producing hot air in committees. The lack of scrutiny has led to very bad law and policy, and I want my MP to be strongly pointing out what the government is doing wrong. So 1 for, 1 against Phil.
Well, all right, fair enough.
Yeah.
Can't argue with that, can I?
So it's the first anniversary of Russia's major offensive into Ukraine. The war has resulted in tens of thousands of deaths on both sides and show no signs of ending.
As the calls come in to give Ukraine longer-range weaponry, the costs of the war are being felt in households all around the world. Our economics editor, Liam Halligan, has this report.
A year ago today, Russia invaded Ukraine, sparking a war that's already killed and injured hundreds of thousands, with no end in sight. The related economic war between Russia and the West has caused sharp rises in the cost of fuel, utilities and food across the world, not least Britain. Russia's historically provided 40% of the natural gas used across Western Europe, while pumping 10% of oil used worldwide. Those supplies have been disrupted. In January 2022, before this war, unleaded petrol in the UK averaged £1.46 per litre. 6 months later, forecourt prices peaked at £1.94 per litre, up more than a third, with prices going above £2 in some parts of the country. Prices have since eased, with unleaded petrol averaging £1.48 so far in February. So petrol prices are roughly back to where they were before the war. But diesel prices, as lorry drivers know, are still around 10% more expensive. Gas and electricity bills, though, are still much higher. In 2021, the average household spent around £1,300 a year on their combined utilities. That cost is now over £2,600, still more than double pre-war levels, despite wholesale energy prices coming down. Russia and Ukraine are also major exporters of wheat, grain and other foodstuffs, impacting prices everywhere. Since the war, UK bread prices are 20% higher, with eggs and milk up 29% and 39%, given the impact on the cost of farmers' feedstocks. And it's this combination of more expensive fuel, power and food that's seen British shoppers endure sky-high inflation. Already 5.5% last January, inflation spiked to 11.1% in October, a 40-year high, and remains in double digits today. That's left the Bank of England with no choice but to raise interest rates from 0.5% last February all the way up to 4% now. Those higher rates have raised mortgage costs, just as inflation has caused pay disputes and the worst strikes since the 1970s. While war is first and foremost a human tragedy, of course, there are economic costs as well. 1 year on, the costs to the British economy and living standards have already been very significant. And there's more to come.
Liam Halligan there, because, yes, most of the morning we have been talking about the sort of personal costs of war and the devastation war brings about, but actually that is the cost of living and the cost financially of war, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, Liam said at the start of his report, it almost, seems too crass to put it in kind of pound signs and everything when you're looking at the number of deaths, but nevertheless, it is a reality. And it's quite difficult sometimes to disentangle exactly what is the cause and effect. I think we would have seen pretty bad inflation even if there hadn't been this war in Ukraine. So that's always a trouble for economists. But yeah, I mean, war is not just expensive in terms of the lives of those lost and those who are injured or have to flee the country. Those are the people at the real cutting edge of it that we should feel the most sympathy for. But it does actually impact on everybody thousands and thousands of miles away.
Yeah. Suzanne, I think Mark makes a good point, though, isn't it? It's very difficult to know. We've seen this huge inflation and increase in prices. Some people blame it on the lockdowns and coming out of lockdown and the sort of surge in demand that happened. Some people say it's down to the war in Ukraine. Some people say it's down to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's budget and all the rest of it. I mean, it's difficult sometimes to know. I suppose you pick whatever is most politically convenient for you.
You forgot the B word, Philip. Brexit.
Oh yes, of course. Yes, it's all down
a lot of people also blame Brexit.
Yes,
I mean,
of course.
I think there's been. I don't blame Brexit, and I don't blame Liz Truss's budget, but no doubt there's been a catalogue of disasters that have befallen us. But I think the key thing about the Ukraine war is that Russia is not suffering nearly as much as everybody expected it to, with the wholesale sanctions that were brought in by Western countries just not happening. And instead, it seems to me that the sanctions, as indeed Putin said they would, are boomeranging back to hit us.
Well, you see, I'd question that about the sanctions and how much Russia is suffering, because I'd say it was a lot, because supposedly their exports on oil and gas has absolutely collapsed.
But their
Russia's
revenues
budget deficit for the first time ever in many, many years, and it's got half its foreign currency sort of in reserve. So it is feeling... So the reason I question that about Russia, it might not tell you and it might not want to exactly explain, but of course it must be suffering, otherwise it wouldn't be wanting to do deals with people like China, who are going to come in with money to support it so it can get its oil. I think we should be very careful how destabilising it has been for Russia.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Russian oil revenues are up 50%. You know, that's from the International Energy. I don't think you can really argue with that. As I said, the Russian economy today, it is sinking. It absolutely is, but not by nearly as much as everybody anticipated it would. And which country is the International Monetary Fund predicting will fall into recession this year and perform worse than any advanced economy?
But the point
is us, not Russia.
But the point is, though, if Russia is that weak, it's starts to do desperate deals with desperate other countries.
That is part of the problem.
Nobody wins with that.
Do you think, Mark, on this is that when people see the economic cost of the war in Russia, do you think this is the type of thing that will weaken the West's resolve, that it will actually get war-weary when they think, I'm not prepared to put up with this cost of living crisis?
That has to be a likelihood, doesn't it? I think Suzanne was saying that Russian GDP the size of their national economy has shrunk by 2%. I mean, that's down.
Yeah.
It's hardly been brought to its knees. And it's a question of resilience, isn't it? And I suppose that you could understand even, that if people equate their very high energy bills and higher prices in the shops with the ongoing war in Ukraine, that it won't be very long before they say this is an event happening in a faraway land of which we know little. So there is going to be a huge test of resilience, not just amongst the Ukrainians, but here in Britain too.
Thank you for that. Now, new research has shown that more than 1.5 million people living outside of London could be impacted by the new London-wide ultra-low emission zone.
ULEZ aims to cut pollution levels across London by charging drivers of vehicles that do not meet minimum emission standards, £12.50 a day. So joining us now is Grant Davis, who is chairman of the London Cab Drivers Club. So what does it mean to people like you, £12.50 a day?
Well, I've got to say, as we're part of public transport as such, the black cabs don't have to pay the ULEZ, OK? But with the whole package of ULEZ, what we found is black taxis that have been diesel have had their age limits cut. So when you buy a cab for 15 years, the mayor's cut that down to 12 years. The cab trade's had to spend £400 million thus far on ULEZ compliant taxis. So there is a cost, there is a big cost. But more importantly, with the mayor, he's ignored 5,000 votes. Up to 80% of residents said they didn't want the ULEZ expansion. And he's just ignored everyone. It's unbelievable that we talk on your programme about how people are falling out of love with politicians and the whole democratic process. This is a reason why, I think.
Grant, we were talking about politicians, need to be popular to get re-elected. Clearly, this isn't very popular, and there is an irony, I suppose, in a Labour mayor basically taxing working class people to this extent, probably the people who can afford it least. So even though you might disagree with his policy, do you accept that he is motivated by trying to improve air quality in the capital? Do you think his motives are good, even if you don't agree with the way he's gone about it?
Listen, you saw yesterday the Unison come out and argue against it because the impact it will have on nurses, people in the NHS. And it's weird that normally what happens with these Labour mayors and Labour politicians, it's the working class that get hit the hardest, which I thought Labour were there to protect the workers, you know. Maybe I've got it wrong. But the problem is, Esther, and you will both know as Conservative MPs, this ULEZ zone with this Labour mayor is just a symptom of the bigger picture, which is net zero. And he's doing this under the umbrella of net zero, which unfortunately your Prime Minister and your party, they support. So if the government's all gang-ho on net zero and everything, you're going to get things like ULEZ extension in London, Manchester, Birmingham. It's going to be a nationwide phenomenon, clean air. And, TfL rely on government bailouts to pay for everything. So if the PM is really serious, right, to do something, he should turn around to Sadiq Khan and say, look, the government are bailing out TfL with our money for you to carry on. You're not bringing this in. That's it, right? It's going to hit hard-working people, cost of living crisis. You know what? We bail TfL out, the money tap stops, and we're not letting you bring this in. And that is the crux of it. Is Rushy a supporter or is he against it? Let's show your real colours, Rushy.
Will he not say this is about devolution and Sadiq Khan keeps winning and being sort of the mayor and it's up for the local people to either vote him in or vote him out?
Well, I mean, you talk about voting in and voting out. I mean, Sadiq Khan got in. I think the Conservatives had a very good run at it with Sean Bailey. It's just a shame, really, that the Conservative Party didn't get behind Sean Bailey a bit stronger. We might not have had to put up with carnage that we got in London at the moment. But listen, like I said, Sadiq Khan is doing this under the umbrella of clean air, net zero. And I said again, unfortunately, your party is all for this. So I don't see, the argument. I really don't.
Grant Davis, thanks very much indeed for joining us. You raise a fair point there. So I'll come back to the studio. Mark, is this about clean air or is this just an easy way to get money in? Because if you're interested in clean air, you'd say those cars come into the city, but we're not going to charge you $12.50. There'll be other ways of doing it like France does. So what's it all about?
Yeah, OK, I don't usually leap to Sadiq Khan's defence and I don't support his policy here, but I'm going to assume he is a sincere man and is doing this for reasons that he believes are worthy, even if Grant and others are sceptical. I quite like using the price mechanism to actually encourage behaviour one way or another, rather than banning things or making things mandatory. I actually like prices. I think that, price signals are good. What I think this teases out, which, Grant was very erudite in expressing, is, look, of course people want cleaner air. Of course there's a case for decarbonisation. But it comes at a price. There is a trade-off here. And I do think that supporters of carbon net zero, cleaner air, all the rest of it sounds very noble, need to be honest about what that price is, because it's not low.
And that has not been the honesty.
The thing that gets me is, though, he imposes this £12.50 a day tax on sort of working-class people who can ill afford it, and then in the next breath says, I'm going to introduce free school meals for everybody because you can't afford to feed your children. Well, there's no wonder people can't afford to feed their children because they're paying these £12.50 a day.
Yeah, it's not very often I disagree with Mark, but I think this is the worst way to introduce policy. I think what Sadiq Khan is basically saying, we've got a clean air problem in London, people are dying, children are getting ill, so that's fine. We'll carry on going, but if you're one of the people contributing, you have to pay £12.50.
Yeah. So if you can afford it, you can do it. Otherwise, you don't. So the rich are OK.
Roads for the rich. Roads for the rich.
So coming up after this break, we'll be speaking to the founder of Free Speech Union as they celebrate their 3rd year anniversary in the next week. All the things they've done in those 3 years. Don't go anywhere.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "No, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
He's the king of breakfast TV, and he's back.
Eamon Holmes back on the TV with me this morning.
Even remember my name.
I know, it's been 4 months. You have holy water by your bed?
Oh, yes. Already to bless.
Oh, Eamon. Oh.
Why do you not believe anything I say?
Eamon Holmes back on GB News Breakfast at 6 a.m.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
Why not take us home with you by visiting the GB News shop at gbnews.store. You'll find all the official merchandise, a really good present actually for yourself, your friends or your family.
We ship across the UK mainland at no extra cost. GB News, the People's Channel.
Welcome back. It's now 11:26. Lots of you have been getting in touch. David here, straight on the email. Sadiq Khan is acting like a tyrant. The people of London should have a mass protest and demand his resignation. That's all on that ultra-low emission zone and charge
just
people.
vote him out.
Yes, £12.50. But if you want a bit quicker, a protest, and everybody else seems to be protesting.
Billy says, I think the world is slow to condemn and react to countries like India and South Africa that are still doing business with Russia. Sanctions should be put on those countries too.
Yeah, and Nigel says countries like India and China are buying cheap energy from Russia, which they are, to make their products cheaper. We should put an import tax on them to grow our economy.
Now, next week marks a third-year anniversary of the Free Speech Union, founded by Toby Young to push back on the increasingly censorious attitude to public expression in Britain. And I'm delighted to say that Toby joins us now. Many congratulations on your anniversary.
On being 3.
Thank you.
You're a toddler.
Oh, before we go to Toby, I think that we're going to save you up, Toby. We're going to save you up because Keir Starmer apparently is making a speech in Cardiff, I believe.
Should you be pushing them to go further? Would you like them to go further?
I think the government is already pushing allies to go further, and they're right to do that. It is important that it's in lockstep with NATO, but Ukraine does need more support, and I think it's good that the government is urging others to go further.
Turning to the Northern Ireland Protocol, you said in the House that the trade-offs would be needed in order to achieve an agreement. What kind of trade-offs are you talking about?
Well, you weren't bumped off for long there by that, but that was just, I think, just to prove that Keir Starmer is in Cardiff.
OK.
Toby. So, yeah, your third anniversary next week. I just wondered, just going back, was there a particular event that happened 3 years ago that made you think this is the straw that breaks the camel's back and I'm going to do something about it?
It was actually being cancelled myself at the beginning of 2018. I was appointed to a new education regulator, the Office for Students, by Theresa May. And as soon as it was announced, the offence archaeologists rolled up their sleeves, went to work, started digging down into everything I'd said or written dating back to 1987. And because I'd been a, professional journalist for more than 30 years, it didn't take them long to find a Tutankhamun's tomb of offensive material, stuff they could say, oh, this is outrageous, I'm really offended, he shouldn't be in this position. And within a week, there was a pack of journalists on my doorstep. My daughter stopped going to school because she hated being asked about it. There was a petition telling Theresa May to fire me, got 225,000 signatures. And so I thought, well, I'd better step down. I'll step down, I'll apologise for some of the more outrageous, sophomoric things I've said over the years. Hopefully that'll draw a line under it. Turned out that was a terrible mistake. That was like throwing a hunk of red meat to a shoal of piranha fish. And they then went crazy, blood in the water, and I then had to step down from 4 other positions, including my full-time job. So I was well and truly cancelled. I lost 5 positions in total. And at the time, when it was happening to me, I remember thinking there really ought to be an organisation I can turn to for help when I'm being targeted by, a Twitchfork mob in this way. My career has turned into a dumpster fire. How do I put it out? Everything I've worked for 30 years is burning to the ground. What can I do? Would it help to apologise? Would it make things worse? Are there legal remedies I should be exploring? Should I go out and talk about it and defend myself or lie doggo? Is there any psychological counselling I can get? And so after I'd recovered, I then thought, I'm going to start that organisation because that needs to exist, given how many people are finding themselves in a similar position. And it started from there.
And so what would you say have been your achievements over these last 3 years?
Well, we've now got 16 employees. We've got over 11,000 members. And I think we've successfully fought close to 500 cases, academics, students, people from every walk of life. One example, we looked after a guy, a train driver for West Midlands Trains, who got into trouble on Freedom Day, July 19th, said on his personal Facebook account, "Thank God the pubs are reopening. I didn't want to live in an alcohol-free Muslim caliphate for the rest of my life." One of his colleagues, even though it was on his private Facebook account, said that he was offended by that, reported him to his bosses. He was placed under investigation and fired for gross misconduct. And we looked after him, took the case to the Employment Tribunal and got a finding of unfair dismissal and a 5-figure sum in damages. But that's the kind of thing we achieved on a
Don't mess with
basis.
Toby. And also the PayPal, the success you had with PayPal. You were on the show at the time.
That was, that turned out to be a blessing in disguise, Esther. I mean, they cancelled the Free Speech Union's account without any real explanation, no notice. And so we went to war with PayPal. We managed to persuade 42 peers and MPs to sign a letter to Jacob Rees-Mogg, then the business secretary, soon to be a GB News host, to ask PayPal what they thought they were doing, to hold them to account. And he denounced what they'd done as a sinister new form of cancel culture, particularly dangerous as we're moving to a cashless society. We can't have big financial services companies demonetising people because they disapprove of their political views. And within 2 weeks, they restored my account.
Do you think freedom of speech is in a better position now than it was 3 years ago, or do you think we're still on a downward spiral?
I think we've been on a pretty downward spiral for the past 3 years, but I think things are just about levelling out. I think we may have reached peak woke. There are some signs of progress. I mean, the fact that the Queen Consort yesterday condemned the censorship by woke sensitivity readers of Roald Dahl's classic children's books, that was a positive sign.
Camilla, a new employee of yours.
The tide feels like it's turning. We'd welcome her as our honorary president.
Suzanne, are you a member of the Free Speech Union? And if not, why not?
Oh, you're right. I'm not a member. I should be, shouldn't
you better
I?
join.
But I did cancel my PayPal account in solidarity, and it remains cancelled. And you absolutely have my full support. I think we have reached peak woke. I think there's a massive backlash, greatly encouraged by people like you in the Free Speech Union, Toby, and thank God for you, and more power to your
But I think you'll be morphing, and we'll have you on another time to talk about, because I think all freedoms now are being put under threat, and people are asking now about the digital ID. We're going to have you back on about that. That's another way to curtail freedoms if it's not words.
Congratulations on your anniversary anyway, and we wish you all the best with your celebrations. Now, coming up, we'll be speaking to the former president of the Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko. But first, here's Rhiannon with the latest news headlines.
Thank you, Philip. It's 11:33. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. A minute's silence has been held across the UK, marking 1 year since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. At Downing Street, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak stood with Ukraine's ambassador to the UK to reflect on the country's losses. Britain's imposed a raft of new sanctions, including an export ban on every piece of equipment that Russia uses on the battlefield. President Putin's closest allies have also been targeted, among them his former chief of security and the chief executive of Nord Stream 2. In Kyiv, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky attended a ceremony with families of soldiers killed in the conflict. He described the past 12 months as a year of pain, sorrow, faith and unity. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians have died following Russia's invasion, which has resulted in the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. In some breaking news, the British Medical Association has announced junior doctors are going ahead with strike action in a dispute over pay. They're set to walk off the job for 3 days from the 13th of March. A fourth man has been arrested in connection with the attempted murder of Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell in Omagh. He's in a critical but stable condition after being shot multiple times by 2 masked gunmen on Wednesday night. Police say dissident Republican group the New IRA is the primary focus of their investigation. And nominations for the SNP leadership race will close at midday following Nicola Sturgeon's surprise resignation last week. Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf, Finance Secretary Kate Forbes and former Community Safety Minister Ash Regan are expected to be on the ballot. Candidates must have at least 100 nominations from a minimum of 20 local party branches to go through. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Don't go anywhere. Esther and Philip will be back in just a moment.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "No, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. It's 11:37. Now, it's been a year since Russia illegally invaded Ukraine, provoking an international outcry against the rogue state. So, what is the future for Ukraine? And can we Brits do more to help? We're joined now by former President of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. So, it's been an awful year. How much longer do you think this war will continue?
Thank you very much indeed. I tell you, from the Donbass, very close to the front line, together with Ukrainian soldiers, who is the hero of the last 9 years. And definitely we delivered, by the way, for 10 million hryvnia, the support of Ukrainian army, which we take from United Kingdom. This is the artillery truck. This is the other equipment which is help Ukrainian troops to stop Russian and to throw it away. This was very difficult here. Can you imagine that Ukraine lost dozens and dozens of thousands of the innocent civilians from Bucha to Mariupol, from the military criminal Putin. But together, can you imagine that 8 million Ukrainians leave Ukraine and go abroad? 2.5 million of Ukrainian children go to the school abroad because of your solidarity. But this is the humanitarian disaster. Additional 7 million people go from Donbass and live to the western part in Ukraine. We lost 35% of our economy. We lost 50% of our critical energy infrastructure. We lost 70% of our iron and steel industry. And definitely, this is the most dangerous and difficult year in our history. But this price Ukraine paid for protect Western world, for protect the continent, to stop the crazy maniac Putin and Russian military. This is the delivering tanks on the front line. And this is the absolutely important role of Ukraine. I'm very much happy that people in Great Britain, people in Europe, people in the world understand that you are not simply assisting Ukraine. You invest in the global security, in the stable security, and the fact that we should win. Now nobody has any doubts. And how world is changed. First of all, you learn from Ukraine, not trust Putin. Second, you learn from Ukraine, not be afraid of Putin. And third, you understand together with us that you now much stronger than a year ago. Your leaders, including your prime minister, together with the US president, European leaders, demonstrate a global leadership. Putin do not expect these type of things. And I keep my fingers crossed that we should make a victory faster. At least every one of us should do maximum we can to accelerate our victory, to bring the sustainable security situation on the continent.
Mr. Poroshenko, I'm sure it's a huge bonus for the people on the front line to see you as a former president on the front line with those soldiers. President Zelensky, of course, was your former political opponent. How do you rate how he's performed over the last year?
Exactly 1 year ago, after 3 hours from first missiles at 4:30 flight 2.5 kilometers from my house, I called Zelensky and met with him in his office. And I said, I am not anymore a leader of the opposition, and you are not anymore my opponent. We have, both of us are soldiers, me and you. And we united around Ukraine, we united around the victory, and only our unity can bring victory for us. And we shake the hands, and I do my best. And for the first month, Zelensky do exactly the same, in spite of some useful idiot who tried to attack for the political purpose. We don't pay attention on that. And until our victory, we definitely should demonstrate the unity. We should demonstrate keeping democracy. We should demonstrate keeping all the values, starting from rule of law and finishing with the freedom of press, because this is the symbol that democracy wins autocracy of Putin. And I have no doubt that we will continue this way.
Mr. Poroshenko, people will say we want this war to come to an end as soon as possible. The world has helped you, and Britain's definitely been leading the way there with tanked, armoured vehicles. And people say, and you will be demanding now for jets and aircraft, so people have been slow coming to the table. Do you think that this extra support of flight power is what is needed to bring the war to an end?
Look, as a former Supreme Commander-in-Chief of Ukrainian Armed Forces who create the new Ukrainian forces under the standard of NATO, I can tell you, weapons is never enough. But we have enough weapons to withstand with Putin, but not enough to throw him away from Ukrainian land. And we need a 5-factor for our victory. Point number 1 is weapons. And we need jet fighter just to stop Russian dominance in Ukrainian airspace. But we definitely need, urgently, ammunition, armed personnel carrier, tanks for providing the offensive operation, long-range missile, and radio electronic warfare system. We need it urgent. We don't need it after 1 year. We need it in March and April, and this is the crucial factor. Not let Russia to prepare for our offensive operation. This, it seems to me now, is easy understandable for everyone. Point number 2, this is the sanction. We should cut the ability of Putin to finance the war. And this would be another strong motivation for Putin to sit at the table of negotiation and after withdrawing Russian troops from Ukraine. Point number 3, this is the sanction. Not sanction, but justice. And justice should be for the military criminal, they should be behind bars. Point number 4 is a financial assistance. Point number 5, this is the full membership of Ukraine in NATO. Because without NATO, no security guarantee can bring the sustainable security situation on the continent. I want to use this opportunity because just today, General Secretary of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, invite Ukraine to participate in the July summit of NATO in Vilnius. And I'm absolutely praying and call to all leaders of NATO member states. Please, on this summit of NATO, please give an invitation to NATO for Ukraine, for Ukrainian people. This is the win-win situation.
Mr. Poroshenko, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and we, of course, wish you and your nation well. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Key points there, 5 key points, Mark, on what they needed. It was the ammunition, it was the support, it was the finance, the criminal justice and NATO.
It's quite a lot, isn't it? But, I mean, it's just stunning what they've managed to achieve so far. As I said, right at the top of the programme, Esther, that I bowed to other experts who thought that the Russians would win this war decisively, take Ukraine and be on the Polish border within weeks or a few months. It's pretty impressive resistance, isn't it?
I thought the key thing that Poroshenko was saying there was that you're not doing this for us, you're doing it for yourselves. This is in your national interest to do this. Do you think that that's because they want to end this sort of fear that we might get war-weary in the West?
I think that's probably right. But if we want an end to this, who am I to disagree with a former Ukrainian president? But the idea that Ukraine should join NATO, that is a massive red line for Putin. That is seriously going to escalate. If NATO gives forward that invitation, then I think we're closer to nuclear war than we have been in my lifetime.
Wow. Suzanne, thank you very much indeed. Mark, thank you very much indeed for joining us for this whole programme.
Now, Sir Keir Starmer outlined his vision for the country if Labour were to win the next general election. Launching his party's 5 national missions, the Labour leader says the UK needs to be more competitive. Joining us now is GB News political reporter Catherine Forster to tell us more.
Yes, so Keir Starmer, Labour leader in Manchester yesterday, outlining his 5 national missions. There's something about the number 5, isn't there? Rishi Sunak outlined his 5 priorities for government. Both of them focused on growth, but Keir Starmer was very specific. He pledged to make the United Kingdom have the highest sustained growth in the G7 by the end of a Labour first term in government. Quite how that would be achieved is not clear, although Labour have made it abundantly clear that they're going to go very hard on green growth. They see this as the future. They want to be an energy superpower, and they think that this will drive growth, amongst other things. Also talking about building a strong NHS, making the streets safe, opportunity for everyone. Much broader, really, and more expansive than Rishi Sunak's very specific 5 priorities, which of course were halving inflation, cutting the debt, growing the economy, stopping the boats and cutting waiting lists. And I suppose that's because Labour do seem to feel and expect at the moment, if the polls are to be believed, that they will form the next government. And there does seem to be a confidence about them. They were talking about sticking plaster politics, saying that none of this could be achieved in the short term, but pretty much making plans for not just a first term in government, but a second term in government, something which would have seemed absolutely inconceivable back in 2019 when Boris Johnson won that 80-seat majority and Jeremy Corbyn led Labour to its worst result since 1935. But I think Labour are going to come under a lot more scrutiny, aren't they, going forward? And one of the problems for Keir Starmer is, of course, he's been a bit of a shapeshifter, hasn't he? He got elected as leader of the Labour Party, promising pretty much to continue Corbynism but without Jeremy Corbyn, and then very quickly he pivoted to the measures that he's now putting forward, that very similar to some of the things the Conservatives are saying. And of course not everybody is happy about that. Now, Labour are broadly happy in that they feel they're closer to government than they have been in a long time. The Conservatives, of course, Greg Hands, the new Conservative Party chairman, has highlighted that though, and he's basically said Keir Starmer will say whatever is politically expedient, and he has no principles. So I think much more scrutiny of Labour going forward, but they do seem very confident at the moment.
Ben Forster, thank you very much indeed for that update, which seems like we've got the battle of Rishi's 5-point plan and Keir's 5 missions. It's the battle of the 5. So let's see who comes out on top of that. But Catherine, thank you very much.
Give me 5.
Yeah, well,
new meaning to that expression. Let's now welcome Sarah Robertson to take a look at the biggest stories from the world of entertainment. Thank you for joining us today. We end on a high. It's been a very reflective show until now. So go on, what's Queen Camilla? Top story.
Top story indeed. So yes, Queen Camilla is going to be using Princess Diana's favoured dress designer, Bruce Oldfield, to be designing her coronation gown, which is obviously coming up in May. Bruce Oldfield dressed Diana. He used to give Diana her glamour, but he now gives Camilla her confidence. And she's been favouring Bruce quite a few times over the last several years. She wore him at the state opening of Parliament back in 2015. We've seen her dressed in his lovely designs Ascot, and she's decided to go with him again to design her coronation gown.
Quite sort of slightly controversial in a way if you're trying to bring the boys back together. You're trying to bring Harry over, and yet you're wearing what your mum would have had as her favourite designer. I didn't know if that was helpful or unhelpful.
Well, I mean, I think obviously fans of Diana would say that she was, you know, maybe again trying to, you know, have a bit of the Diana star power rub off on her, and who could blame her? You know, Diana was the most, you know, seen as the world's most beautiful woman, wasn't she? And whatever she wore sold out. So you can understand that, and Bruce does make women look amazing. You know, that's his skill as a designer. So I can understand
it's political, or do we think it just so happens she just likes his stuff?
I think, like most women, she really likes his designs and knows that he makes you look wonderful, and he just knows how to design for you know, an older lady and bring out that glamour, that elegance, that confidence. And I just wanted to say as well that him and Diana actually, they never fell out or anything, but he said back in 1990, Diana sort of then started favouring other designers like Catherine Walker and other people, although they always stayed friends. So actually there was like a sort of slight parting of the ways with that, so there you go. On to the next thing. Ken Bruce, as we know, has stepped down from Radio 2. His replacement, Vernon Kay, was announced today. Vernon, 48, taking the hot seat. Ken Bruce's spot on Radio 2 was the most listened to show in all of Europe, but Vernon as replacement, this has been met with dismay from listeners of Radio 2. Obviously, Ken Bruce had a huge following, and fans have just said, no, they're sick of this, you know, constant modernising to try and attract younger listeners, and, you know, there's fears that Vernon won't play the old classic hits and doesn't have Ken's warmth. But he's promised he's going to try and keep the family of Radio 2 listeners going.
It's difficult, isn't it? For, you know, it's not Vernon Kay's fault that the BBC got rid of Ken Bruce, is it? You know, and, you know, but it's a tough gig to follow, isn't it?
Of course.
It's a thankless task.
There's a big ageism problem, I think, going on within the BBC, as we've seen, you know, over the last couple of years, with several older presenters departing for other places.
You also frequently say, don't amend if it's not broken.
Exactly.
And if somebody's still popular and the audience still want him, then why upset everybody? Because that's what you've done. You've upset all of your customers, as it were. So what's the next thing then?
So
what's
next
Una Healy?
thing, yes. So I spoke a few weeks ago about Una Healy and the boxer David Hay being in a throuple with David's other girlfriend. Una, the throuple is over.
Well, I did say I didn't see. I said I could see it ending unhappily. I couldn't see it working out.
Exactly, it wasn't going to work.
Does that mean there's a vacancy?
Well, I think there must be, because for David Hay it was working lovely. So, you know, queue up, ladies, if you want to step into Una's place. But as is the way with modern-day romances, it all ends on Instagram. So all the photos of them together enjoying their New Year's and various holidays, all holding hands as the three, all been deleted from Una's Instagram.
Do we know what?
We don't, but Una's been spending time with her children, and she has faced a lot of criticism and negativity from members of the public, from fans asking, Una, you're a mother, what on earth are you doing? Why are you getting involved in this? It's tawdry.
Now, the one story I want to know about is Yoko Ono
Yes. Now, Yoko has just celebrated her 90th birthday this week. I know, she's absolutely amazing, isn't she? But she has now relocated full-time from her home that she shared with John Lennon in New York. That was the Dakota building, famously where John Lennon was shot outside by Mark Chapman back in 1980. And Yoko is now living full-time at the farmhouse that her and John bought in the 70s. That's up in Franklin, New York State. She's having round-the-clock care there now because her health is starting to suffer. I mean, she's 90. You know, she's been in a wheelchair. She's now sort of really retired from public life now. And she's decided to stay full-time at this beautiful 600-acre farmhouse that she bought with John. And there she is.
Sarah Robinson, fantastic.
Thank
you always bring us the latest showbiz stuff there. So what can I say? That's all of us. That's it for today from all of us here. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Andrew Pearce is next. And don't forget to join us tomorrow at 10 a.m. See you then.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst. Welcome to your latest broadcast from the Met Office. Cloud and patchy rain sinking south through the day ahead. Sunshine will follow though, but starting to feel fresher for everyone. Looking at the bigger picture, here's those weather fronts pushing south through the course of the day. High pressure though, always nearby, if anything, moving in for the weekend, meaning there'll be plenty of dry weather to come, though the cloud will build at times. Cloud across the central swathe of the UK first thing Friday morning, patchy rain and drizzle. Blue skies across the far south of England with a patchy frost soon being replaced by cloud.